All right, well, we are back, and let us discuss how we measure the behavioral consequences of personality. So, personality is thought to lead to behavior, right? That you have inside of you some consistent traits or predispositions or what temperaments that can be combined into what we would call personality, and that those internal states are what lead you to behave in the way that you behave. Now, this is a major assumption that personality drives behavior. Not all theorists agree with this idea. Some theorists think that external factors are more important in determining your behavior than personality is. But let's just kind of go with this. Let's follow this assumption and say personality leads to behavior. So, how can we go about measuring the behavioral consequences of personality? Well, like I mentioned earlier, one way to measure personality is to use self-report scales. So, in this strategy, the advantages are going to be that we can get lots of information really quickly. You can, well, when I was in graduate school, we actually had to print the personality scales and we had to distribute them to live people who completed the personality scales, in our laboratory. Or we thought it was really quick when we could have everybody who's enrolled as a psychology student all go to this one gigantic room that sat like, I don't know, 5,000 people or something, because we could get 3,000 data points all at one time because we had so many introductory psychology classes going. And so we would take our little printed personality scales, we'd distribute it to everybody who was there. In an hour, we would collect up all of the personality scales, and it didn't cost that much. We just had to make photocopies. Maybe we were using a personality scale that has a copyright on it, so maybe we had to pay a fee to own it, but it's relatively inexpensive. And a lot of the results are used to do correlational studies. And so surveys oftentimes provide us, these self-report scales allow us to do a statistic called correlations to see if the variables go together. So that gives us a lot of power, right? Even in the olden days of my graduate school years, it was quick and inexpensive. Today, it's even quicker and less expensive because we can send a URL to people and they can complete the survey online, right? So it doesn't really cost us anything at all to do it. I mean, the university or college maybe subscribes to SurveyMonkey, and we can just give the URL to our students who are enrolled in classes, and it's all very inexpensive, very quick now. And in fact, it's even quicker with the online version because we don't have to sit there with the pieces of paper and score each individual scale. We can actually just upload the data and use our computer software to score the scales. And it's gotten even more quick and even less expensive. So those are really profound advantages that we cannot sneeze at. That is for sure. There are some major disadvantages to this strategy also, like sampling problems. I keep mentioning we administer these to our college, to our psychology students, right? I mean, we are not making any claims that we are representing even students who aren't taking a psychology class, which, some people don't take a psychology class for like a systematic reason. They honestly don't like it, or they are not the kind of person who thinks they would like it, or whatever. And so you get different kinds of people who take introductory psychology classes than those who don't. So right off, we don't know if our sample represents anything outside of the group of people who are willing to take an introductory psychology class. We also, when we do self-report scales, have to worry about the accuracy of the answers that people are giving. One type of sort of cognitive bias that we see people display is something called social desirability, where they may answer the question on the scale in a way that they think makes them look better, rather than in a way that is accurate for them. So they may report behaviors that they have engaged in that they never really have, or they may deny having engaged in behaviors that they really have done. And really with the goal being that they want to come out looking better. They're worried about what the researcher's going to think about them. So social desirability is one kind of, systematic kind of inaccuracy that we might see. False consensus is another one. A lot of times people believe that everybody else is in agreement with something and they don't want to be the outlier who says something different. I'm recording this video in March of 2022, and the governor of the state of Washington just announced that we're going to be removing the indoor mask mandate. And so a survey was distributed to find out whether we should immediately upon the governor's date stop having masks on campus, or if we should wait until the start of spring quarter. And when I first got in to take the survey, I honestly thought, I wonder what everybody else is saying, right? Am I going to be the only person who gives the answers that I'm going to give, right? You don't want to stand out. You don't want to be socially undesirable. You don't want to, you know what I mean? You worry about those things when you take a survey. And this is kind of I guess this is kind of a controversial issue in a certain way, because masks have become kind of a controversial thing instead of, just being a potential way to block infection. It's become like a way to signal your virtue or who you voted for or something. I'm not sure. But even I, who know about surveys, and I know that the only way to get good data is to be honest, I sat there for a second looking at the questions going, I wonder if everybody else is going to say one thing and I'm going to be the only one who says something else. And that's what we mean with false consensus. We worry that everybody else is in agreement, and then we're going to be the outlier, and we're going to look foolish, or we're going to look biased, or we're going to look, some negative way that we don't want to look. So we give an answer that's not correct, not accurate for ourselves. The next one can go either way. Acquiescence is where a person says yes to questions that they don't really agree with. They're just going along with it because, they're the kind of people who want to go along. And then there's the other kind of person who we call it naysaying. They say no to things, even when they really do agree with those statements. They say no to it because they want to be that kind of contrarian who doesn't, you don't describe me. This doesn't describe my behavior. So they're naysaying. Either one is an incorrect answer. They're answering the questions differently than they would if they were just giving the honest answer. And then the last thing I wanted to say about self-report scales is that the way that the question is written can affect the kinds of answers that the person gives. So if you write a question in sort of a leading way so that the person who's taking the scale can see what the quote unquote correct answer is, you can lead people into giving answers that are consistent with what the question has set up as the correct answer, rather than their own personal, set of behaviors and stuff like that. So one pieces of good news is that we have ways to design scales so that these disadvantages, with the exception of the sampling problems, but the inaccurate answer problem and the questions affecting answers, we have a whole field in psychology called psychometrics, where people design surveys, and they test them out. They make sure that the questions are working the way that they're intended to work and things like that, so that a lot of these things are controlled for in psychological scales. And that's why some of them you have to pay for. Some of the scales, there has been a lot of time, money invested into the development of the scale. And so the publisher wants their money back, right? So they charge for the scale. So we try to get around some of these disadvantages through the design of the scales. Now, another way to measure behavioral consequences would be to conduct a case study. This is the kind of design where you have one or maybe a couple of people who are in the study who share some kind of quality. And the researcher gets to know those individuals or that individual really, really in great depth. They ask really a lot of questions about their childhood, their current behaviors, their dreams, maybe their hopes, all these, they ask all sorts of things. They might give them psychometric tests where we're like, maybe psychomotor, where we ask you to move objects or answer math questions or things that seem like they have nothing to do with personality. But if you get a really, really, detailed picture of all the different aspects of the individual, then you get a better picture of their personality. The positive side about this is that a lot of times you can't get this information any other way except for through a case study, because you're studying a single individual who maybe has a really rare trait, like maybe they have multiple personality disorder, or what is in modern terms called dissociative identity disorder. So maybe you're wanting to get to understand them really in great detail because they've got this really rare, very uncommon disorder, and you really want to understand them better. maybe they belong to a very rare group, right? Like maybe they are former presidents of the United States, or NFL quarterbacks, or, there's just not that many of them. And so if you get a hold of one, you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to study this one, and assume that they are basically representative of other members of their group. At any given time, we have maybe 5 living presidents, who are not currently president. So if you can get a hold of one, you can imagine that you might want to do a really thorough case study. And so having some characteristic that makes you really rare means that you might be a good candidate for being a case study. And there's no other way to get that information. Now, the disadvantages: the person who you get to study as a case study may not really be representative of the group that they come from. The president example is a good one, because they may not match on anything except for that they were presidents in the past, right? They may have completely different perspectives on political questions, on, world relationship questions. They may have very different ways of presenting themselves, different values. They may, so if you grab one and say, this is what former presidents are like, you may come to just a really wrong conclusion, right? A lot of times when we are doing case studies, it's with a person who is in some kind of clinical situation. That's the most common place for case studies to be conducted. And a lot of times they're in the clinical setting doing, some kind of therapy or something like that, because something is acutely going on right now. And so when you're trying to figure out why this thing is acutely happening right now, you have to ask about, what could have led up to this? What happened in your childhood? What was your schooling like? All these things that have happened in the past. Have you ever had an accident? Have you ever had a concussion? These kinds of things. So what you're doing is you're asking the person to look back into the past and remember things. Anytime we ask people to look back in the past and remember things, we have opportunities for them to have forgotten something. I listed that as an oversight. They may have forgotten that they had that concussion when they were in 2nd grade, or they might distort information where maybe they're remembering having experienced something that they actually saw in a movie when they were a little kid. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you're like, I don't know if this happened to me, or if it was a dream, or if I saw it in a movie. I oftentimes will say that to my mom. I'm like, okay, I'm telling you something that could be a memory of mine. It could be something else. I'm going to give you a vague description, and you are going to be the person who was conscious at the time, and maybe you can tell me what really happened. And actually, I've had many of those cases where I want her to confirm or disconfirm something. And it's surprising how often it turns out she goes, no, that was a movie. It was, we took you to see that movie, and here's the rest of the plot. And it's like, oh man, I thought it happened to me. It's shocking how many times we have memory distortions like that, where we can't really remember where we got this information. Maybe a friend told us a story and we've sort of internalized it, or it happened to our sibling. I heard a guy on the radio a number of years ago talking about how he and his 3 brothers were out running around in the woods, and one of them tripped over an exposed root, fell, and broke his arm. They weren't supposed to have been out in the woods because mom and dad weren't home. And so they rushed home. They tried to play it off like the one with the broken arm wasn't really injured, but ultimately mom and dad figured out there was something wrong. And, the kid got his arm set. Here's the funny thing. The person who was telling us the story goes, I swear I'm the one who spent the summer with my arm in a cast. And so does each of my brothers. They all think that they are the ones who had their arm in a cast. None of them knows for sure, objectively in their own minds, which of them actually broke their arm. Now that seems like something you would remember, having actually been the one to physically break your arm. But they're like, each of us insists it was me. Now, of course, I'm listening to the radio going, have you thought of asking your parent? Have you thought of checking your medical records? Like, there's some ways to objectively confirm it. But the guy on the radio thought it was just a really interesting thing that, first off, that his presentation was, it's so interesting that my brothers incorrectly believe that they're the ones who broke their arm, because he is convinced it was him, but so are they. That's what we call a memory distortion. And when we ask people to look back into their childhoods to explain things that happened, we don't know which parts of what they're saying are true and which parts are incorrect memories, or building up something that didn't really happen quite like that. And that's a really significant problem with case studies. Um, Archival information is when we go into some kind of existing set of information that was collected for some other purpose. So it could be arrest records, or it could be academic records, or like I just said, medical records. These kinds of things this stuff was recorded not for the purposes of a psychological research study or an examination of personality. They were collected for some other purpose. And then we use it now. We, as a researcher, go into that data to see if we can get any kinds of patterns that would help us to explain a person's personality. The advantage of archival information is that it's unbiased. It's just there. It is what it is. It was recorded for some other purpose. It wasn't trying to fulfill our hypothesis, that's for sure. It's a really great way to get comparative information, so we can compare like how things were 100 years ago to how they are today, or how one society compares to another society, things like that. It's just objective data that we can kind of use for those kinds of comparisons. It's what we call non-reactive. This data can't change itself to suit the current researcher's bias or perspective. The disadvantage is there's not much opportunity to do this kind of research. A lot of the times, the kinds of things that are recorded don't have much impact on personality. So there's not much opportunity to use this technique. But a lot of times when we're studying one kind of personality trait, which is intelligence, people want to look at if the person's ever had an intelligence test administered or something like that. Well, a lot of times the desired information may not exist. Maybe that person's never taken an intelligence test. You wish that you could figure out what their IQ is, but all you have available to you is their GPA. And I think we can all agree that intelligence and GPA are not necessarily perfectly going to track, right? Like really intelligent people may not have the highest grades, and the people with the really highest grades may not have the highest intelligence, right? So you may have to substitute something that does exist in the archives that isn't a perfect match for what you're trying to do. And then the last disadvantage is that where you might see some kind of trend in the data, that maybe across time you're seeing, an increase in this kind of behavior. One personality researcher currently is looking at social anxiety in young people, and she started measuring it in the 1980s, and she's been collecting it repeatedly, and now here we are. And this was prior to COVID. So post-COVID, we might even have more, a higher rate now that people have been locked in their houses so long. But what we're seeing is more and more social anxiety in college students. Being able to see that there is this trend, it doesn't really explain why. I mean, post-COVID, I think we might have a really ready explanation. But prior to that, why would young people be displaying more and more social anxiety? It doesn't really explain why the trend exists. Physiological measures would include things like EEGs, functional MRIs. The electromyograph measures heart rate. Galvanic skin response measures how much your palms are sweating, things like that. The advantage of this kind of technique is that it's objective. It's just measuring what your physiological response is. The disadvantage is we're not exactly sure what that has to do with personality. So we have some kinds of studies where they've put these things together, but it's just not really clear that these physiological measures are representing what the researchers are claiming they are. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about how to evaluate personality measures.